Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's 6:30. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. No rush. We thought maybe if we did these high top tables, there wouldn't be that sort of, the force field within the first couple pews for folks. It's like, well, if we're all sitting and we're all casual, maybe it won't feel so bad being in the first and second pews. Well, thanks so much for being here this evening. My name is Adam Anderson. I'm the pastor of South Jacksonville Presbyterian Church. And on behalf of all the members, I'd like to welcome you here this evening for another one of our Flourishing Together events. This is, I realize, it's the fourth one of these that we've done. We did 3 in 2022, and this would have been our fourth one, but we had to move it to 2023. We started with a really invigorating discussion about the war in Ukraine. We also had, I think a couple of you may have been here when we did the talk about Christian nationalism. That was good. And goodness, I should remember. Oh, yes, and we had 90 Forward here, which was an amazing evening of discussion with 90 Forward. The idea of the Flourishing Together series was really an opportunity for us as a church to be thinking critically about the needs of our community and to invite people to come together to be thoughtful and to be loving and to hopefully make meaning together. And so this evening is an extension of that. I know that, I'm somewhere in between not young and maybe not old enough yet, right? I turned 40 this year, but I remember growing up really believing, growing up in a more fundamentalist denomination, that there was something to be said about owning a narrative, right? There was something to be said about claiming it and knowing that it was the one. There was comfort there. But as I got older, what I realized is that comfort maybe is a false comfort. And the ability for us to have good conversations with each other, faithful conversations with each other, recognizing that the narrative that is the one that is dominant is not always the correct one, doesn't always tell the full story, helps us all to be more faithful people. And so this evening is an extension of that. And I'm excited. It's been really great as the last couple of these. We've had opportunities to have partners with us. We worked with One Jackson. Now we're working with the Interfaith Center of Northeast Florida. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Hutto, who is going to be moderating this evening and leading the conversation. But thank you again for being here. If you noticed in the slides, our next one is coming up in mid-March, March 12th at 4 o'clock. It will be right back here. It's going to be a showing of a movie called At the River. It's a documentary that profiles Presbyterian pastors that were actively preaching and leading churches during the civil rights era in the South. It's a fascinating, even just the preview is moving. The director, Carolyn Crowder, is going to be here. So if you have folks who are also, movie buffs or are film majors and would be interested in sitting with a director, I think it's just going to be a fascinating afternoon. So please put that on your calendars. We do have an email list that we keep, and this would be the final thing. And we'd love for you to be part of this. We won't spam you with anything else other than upcoming events for the Flourishing Together series. So if you are interested in finding out when we do the next one of these, in your pews are these like bookmarky things. They look like little bookmarks. Yep, right there. You can tear off at the bottom your name and your email address. I don't need to know your address or your phone number. But if you can put that sort of in the back this evening, we'll just add you to our email list so that we can keep you in the loop of all the things that we're doing. We're excited. We're talking more about issues like immigration and some others, and we're excited to discuss those faithfully. So without any further ado, Rebecca, take it away.
So I, too, am really, really glad all of you are here for this important conversation. We started talking, along with Matt Hartley, who is out of town this week, about this topic, obviously last summer, but mainly when 3 of our friends here were on the WJCT panel hosted by the sub for Melissa Ross at the time, talking about religious diversity around this issue of the Dobbs decision. And it wasn't exactly a religious diverse audience. Our friend here, Parvez, actually got moved to another room because there wasn't any space for him at the table. And it prompted this idea of we really need to have a conversation about the diversity of views on this issue, particularly within the religious spectrum, but the non-religious spectrum. The quote that I pulled from this LA Times article, it says, "For decades, anti-abortion Catholic and evangelical Christian perspectives have dominated the religious conversation. People of faith hold a variety of views on the issue, rooted in their own traditions, teachings, and laws." So we pulled together this group. We had to reschedule due to, like most of you, illness. Things came up. And so I'm really thankful that everyone could be here this evening. We have a flyer in the pews as well. We're always happy to do things together. We have a couple of events coming up. Not only this one, but on February 7th, we're hosting the first ever Interfaith Mayoral Town Hall. That invite will go out tomorrow with further details about that. We're also getting together with Jewish Family Services to talk more about their Holocaust education bins that they provide in classrooms. If you don't know about that, I would love for you to come. That's probably going to be end of March. And then I see 3 of our cooks who are here this evening who will be helping in the kitchen at our Interfaith Ramadan Passover and Easter meal at the Jacksonville Jewish Center on April 10th. It'll be really exciting to cook together during that time and learn together, be creative with recipes. And we will have our Spring Awards Dinner coming up as well. So those are just some of the things going on with the Interfaith Center. But I would first like to just allow my colleagues and friends to introduce themselves. If you have, those of you who are on the radio show, if you have a reflection about that experience, feel free to share it. But yeah, introduce so we all can know each other. And Nancy and Carl, you can come up closer to the front. I called you out. Parvez, would you go first?
Good evening. Is this on?
Yeah, it is.
Good evening. My name is Parvez Ahmed. I am the founding board member for the Interfaith Center for Northeast Florida. Have been involved in interfaith dialogue and civic conversations ever since we moved here almost 2 decades ago. My day job is I'm professor at the College of Business at UNF, and I was one of the panelists at the show at First Coast Connect. But it's more than my experience on the show. It's just that as I have been following the debate and conversations about abortion and a woman's right to choose and all of that, whenever a religious perspective is offered, it's only one religious perspective. It is not only one religious perspective from one religious tradition, it is a particular religious perspective from one religious tradition, and to the exclusion of everything. As the New York Times just did a long story about how faith has informed the abortion debate, and there was literally one sentence quote from a Jewish leader, and the rest of it was just about the Christian narrative on it. So I think that's what kind of prompted the conversation, and Rebecca proposed the idea that why don't we have an interfaith conversation about post-Dobbs.
Thanks. Do you want to go next?
Good evening. My name is Susan Ticker. I am here representing the Jewish community, although I am not a clergy and I have no official title in Jacksonville. I'm a Jewish educator. I happen also to be a clergy spouse, which I've been for many, many years, and I am the mom and mother-in-law of 2 clergy here in Jacksonville.
You qualify.
Thanks. Which I think also has really allowed my husband and me, when we moved a year ago, to enter very quickly into the middle of a wonderfully vibrant Jewish community. I'm particularly interested in interfaith work and have been for a very long time. It's hard to even know what to include because I've done so many different things in each of the communities where we have lived, from leading Seder in a church or working with the interfaith groups at this Union Theological Seminary in Manhattan when I was working towards my doctorate. My undergraduate degree is from Brown University in ancient Judaism and early Christianity. So I've really been interested in this topic for a very long time, and I'm just so thrilled to have been invited to be here at this forum.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, that's right. There's a second.
I am Sarah Locke, and I'm the pastor for Jacksonville Campus Ministry, which serves all of the campuses and young adults here in Jacksonville. And I was a part of the panel that happened, it feels like it was like 4 years ago. But it was just last summer that we did that. And it was an interesting experience to be in the room and have just, like you said, one sort of stance and one theological framework kind of dominating that room, despite there being several viewpoints actually present. And despite there being a moderator. So it was a really interesting experience, and I'm thankful to be here this evening. So,
thank you. So just to start out, as the initial, to put the diversity forward, that one of the initial questions we discussed was from your own practice. We know that not any one of us represents all of the totality of the faith traditions that are up here, but from your practice within your religious faith, how do you understand and believe in the reproductive rights of individuals, especially with the medical practice of abortion? Where do you feel like your practice of your faith in your faith community? And I can share from my own, I know there's a couple Presbyterians in the room, but the Presbyterian Church was very quick to put out a statement when the document was leaked early on, and then has put out several historical statements. I know here at South Jax, Reverend Joyce Lieberman, did a presentation on the Presbyterian history, and the Presbyterians as a whole have defended Roe and asked that local churches and elected officials codify Roe, and so very supportive mainly of the right to choose because of the disadvantages in healthcare, because of the disadvantages in poverty and prenatal care, bringing up some of those ethical issues. The Presbyterians very clearly have been in support of the Roe decision, but like all traditions, there's a history going all the way back to the 1800s. I enjoyed studying that history and would love to share more if anyone is curious to know about just the Presbyterians, Christians. But would anyone else like to go next? From your own practice of your faith, how do you understand a woman's right to choose?
Well, as a man, I'll take the microphone first to talk about a woman's right to choose. It's perfect. So from the Islamic tradition, there is no one point of view, which is why after Dobbs, even when the document was leaked and after the final decision came around, there was no official statement from any major Muslim group that I could think of, either pro or against, because within the tradition, there is the widest diversity of opinion on this matter. It starts with the premise, which is interesting because Islam as a religious tradition comes after Judaism and Christianity, and yet it has never taken a hard position on abortion. It has always kind of left it in that unsaid, unspoken middle. So when we look at the text, the textual perspective, and I'll come to the praxis of it, the practice of that idea, but from a textual perspective, there is literally nothing in the Quran, the primary source of religious sacred text in Islam, about abortion. The only thing that the Quran talks about is the sanctity of life, which is not unlike any other religious tradition. There is a verse in the Quran which is also relevant from the Jewish tradition, because it is also the Talmudic tradition in Judaism, which talks about if you take one life, it is as if you have taken the life of all human beings. If you save one life, it is as if you have saved the life of all of humanity. So that kind of places in the center the sanctity of life. And then there is a verse that talks about, do not kill your children out of poverty. But when you look at that, that is not abortion. It's talking about children. When it is not a fetus in the womb, when it is a fully formed human being outside the womb. So there's nothing actually about abortion in the sacred text. So what the tertiary sources then, which is the prophetic sources, traditions that talk about, is to for scholars to kind of tease out, when does life actually begin? And this is one of those questions that neither science nor religion can give us a definitive answer, which is what I think is a source of much of the debate around abortion. So from the religious perspective, Islamic religious perspective, the closest we come to that answer is in a prophetic tradition. The prophetic tradition in Islam are either the sayings or the approvals or the actions of Prophet Muhammad when he lived, as was recorded by his companions and transmitted over time. Just to give you a little bit of a caveat, the prophetic traditions are not the same as the Quran. From the Muslim perspective, the Quran is the word of God. It was preserved during the lifetime of the Prophet. So there is, and it's a first-person narrative. But the prophetic traditions are what the Prophet said, somebody heard it, transmitted it to somebody else, then it was not written almost 150, 200 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad. So from the prophetic traditions, what we gather is a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace be upon him, when he talks about that when a fetus is formed, it is formed as a flesh in the first 40 days, and then a little bit more than a flesh after 40 days, and then it goes on, and it talks about that then the angel comes and breathes the soul into the fetus, and it's about at the 120th day, so after the first trimester. So if I take that perspective and tease out the answer, then I would say, well, human life begins at 120th day and after. So that means within the first trimester, there is no prohibition on abortion because it's not human life. It is just a collection of cells at that point. So that would be the answer. And then there are other traditions. This is from the legalistic traditions, what is called the Sharia in Islam, where we get other answers about, well, how do you balance between the life of the life inside the womb and the life of the mother? And there is absolutely no controversy in Islam. It is always the life of the mother first, and under all circumstances, the life of the mother will be first. The life and the health of the mother will be first. And the third question, then it comes at, what about rape and incest? And over there, we also have a spectrum of opinion, some saying that even if it's rape and incest, the baby should be carried out, particularly after the first trimester. And if it is, and others say no. And what we know from praxis is during the latest example that we know was during the Bosnian genocide, almost universally Muslim clerics gave the opinion that if since rape was being used as a tool of genocide, gave the opinion that abortion would be allowed. So again, there is no one answer to the question. So there is no, here is the Islamic opinion. There are many, many opinions, and there is no official opinion on this one, because Islam does not have a centralized church, unlike other traditions.
But just to hear that one statement came after the Bosnian, I mean, that kind of blows my mind a little bit. Thank you, Parvez.
So, whereas the Jewish tradition has as complicated a set of texts and prophetic traditions and legal documents and all of that, the answer is a lot simpler in the case of Jewish tradition, Jewish wisdom, and Jewish law, and that is Judaism supports abortion in many, many, many circumstances, and Judaism supports abortion largely because of several specific values, which I'll be happy to enumerate. But Judaism believes that life really begins with breath, and the soul is breathed in immediately upon birth, or immediately prior to birth, but it's that day, not prior. So it makes it a lot easier. There are the biblical text, which I think is the source that's most relevant, and actually it's very interesting because of course we have, as Parvez mentioned, similar traditions and basic texts that we all share, and we talk about a Judeo-Christian ethic. We talk about the commonalities. The Exodus text and the Deuteronomy text, so from the 5 books of Moses, the earliest texts in the Jewish tradition, speak about when there is an injury to a woman who is pregnant and she loses the baby. It's never considered a homicide or a murder or punishable by the death of the person who was responsible, or there's never even much attention paid to, why did this happen or how did it happen. It's not a crime, and to the extent that it's compensatable, it is compensable in monetary terms, or in the language of the text, an eye for an eye, kind of a tooth for a tooth. But that has been understood for many, many years, for at least 1,500 years, as paid by money, not by giving one's life or giving one's eye. The values that underlie the Jewish tradition, which I think we all, and many of us share, are, we call it kavod habriot, honoring all creatures, b'tselem Elohim, all people are created in the image of God, pikuach nefesh, preserving human lives. We are all responsible for one another, kol Yisrael arevim zeh bazeh, and tzedek tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue, and it's considered just to support the full human rights of the mother, spiritual, psychological, physical, medical, trauma, are all considered valid reasons for an abortion. I'm not going to say that Judaism supports abortion in the week prior. It gets much more complicated as we move on, but most women who are experiencing trauma will experience that trauma before the week prior to birth, so this usually doesn't come up as a problem. And I'm not saying that they would argue that she wouldn't be supported. I'm just saying it could get more complicated. But let's just recognize that for all intents and purposes, for many months into the pregnancy, Judaism does support and prioritize the life of the mother over the life of a fetus, which is not considered to be either a person or an equal human life.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan.
Oh, all right. He's just taking up a seat.
This makes all of us look even better.
There you go. That's what it is. He's just making us look good. So I come from the evangelical Lutheran Church in America. That is the tradition that I grew up in, and it is one of the various Lutheran churches. And we are, as the ELCA, that's Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the most progressive and also the largest denomination of Lutheranism in the United States. Even so, we, and I'm going to speak as the denomination and not as all of Christianity, because that's just too broad. And as we know, there's just too many opinions and theological assumptions around all of Christianity. But the ELCA, they have what are called social statements, and it's basically a 3 to 6 year process of getting the highest and best thinkers in the church at the time together in a room, sort of like a church think tank. And they put together a social statement that then goes out to the congregations and is a part of a discussion group, and they get feedback from congregations and churches and lay leaders and folks. And then eventually it gets put into a very long social statement. And so when things like gun control come up and abortion come up and other various immigration, the ELCA puts together this process. And so the last time that they had a social statement on abortion was in 1991. So that makes it older than I am. Even then, it is more nuanced than a lot of more evangelical churches or fundamentalist churches would be. Even so, it is fairly conservative coming out of 1991. And so it starts off saying, like, we are supportive of life, which means more than being anti-abortion. And so then it goes into kind of what does it mean to be supportive of life, and talks about the need for better health care for people, making sure that people have access to contraceptives and sexual education, which is, as we know, a real problem here in Florida. And making sure that sexual violence is prevented in the church, outside of the church, that there are laws that are enforceable for sexual violence and those sorts of things. Support in communities for people who have unwanted pregnancies. And then the social statement goes into a little bit more of, if we can avoid abortions, that's what we would like to do. And so that is the ELCA social statement. My own convictions are a little bit different, simply because of the context in which I work and what I have learned through my own Lutheranism. And I think that one of the things that is just really important to me is that I work with a lot of non-religious students. And for the narrative to be dominated by evangelical fundamentalist Christianity is really detrimental to my non-religious and non-Christian students. And that is, to me, to have laws made only through Christianity is an atrocity. And that when we work with folks who have gone through really traumatic experiences and that have unwanted pregnancies and don't have the access to the care that they need, it compounds the sort of trauma and the economic issues that they face. And some of my students have faced those issues. And so in terms of my theological stance on abortion, it's very much that we want to uphold the dignity and the autonomy of every human being. And my denomination does not define when life begins. That's not something that they have in their social statement. They don't say when life begins. They don't say at what point an abortion is morally justifiable and when it is not. What they did put out was a statement after the reversal of Roe v. Wade that said, we absolutely do not support the prevention of safe and affordable health care to people who can be pregnant. So,
thank you, Sarah. Well, I kind of have a two-part question. Again, speaking from our own faith traditions, I really do appreciate, the honesty and diversity and how much I'm learning at this moment. One, some of you have already answered this, but do you feel like your religious community, or you yourself as a religious person, your views and values have been heard by the larger community? And also, Susan gave me this idea of what about your faith tradition provides you comfort and what doesn't when it comes to reproductive health? So do you feel like your practice, your faith has been heard? And what about your faith practice and its views provides you comfort? I think, Sarah, you nodded a little bit to that about statements that our denomination might put out. But what provides you comfort and what do you struggle with?
In terms of being heard, no. I mean, because if the overturning of Roe v. Wade was based on understanding of abortion from a particularistic tradition, then obviously the viewpoints of minority religious groups were not heard in this process. There is an interesting, I do not know where this legal case is going. I think a Jewish congregation in South Florida has sued precisely because of that reason, because that is essentially like the state imposing religion.
It's Rabbi Silver, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I wish some Muslim groups would have joined that lawsuit. I think that would have strengthened the case, because again, it is not so much to say what is the Islamic perspective, but to say that what is being put forward is certainly not the Islamic perspective. And so, and in terms of our personal understanding of reproductive choices, again, there is a gamut of experiences people have. Somebody who is in the Muslim community, there's a large Bosnian refugee community in Jacksonville. I think it's the second largest Bosnian refugee community in the country, who fled the horrors of genocide. For them, many of them were probably victims of rape and other forms of atrocities that were perpetrated during that genocide. For them, reproductive choice would be very different, because their trauma informed their choices. So given that, to impose a particular set of religious views on that traumatized person would be a disservice to religion, in my view. So even when some people adhere to a more conservative opinion on reproductive choices, they should not use those viewpoints to impose on another person, because it would completely traumatize a person and make them feel prisoners within the religious traditions. And I think that would be, but interestingly, within the Islamic tradition, although there is a wide range of perspectives on reproductive choice, abortion particularly, if you look at literature, official literature from a certain publication house or being published by a certain group, they would often default to a more conservative position. And I was reading a set of literature this morning to prepare for this evening's conversation, and I laughed after a while. I started laughing at it. It's because the literature started by saying abortion is forbidden in Islam, and then it goes on to say, here are all the reasons why it's an exception. Here are all the exceptions to this statement that it is forbidden. So once you have a lot of exceptions, well, really it is not forbidden then. Because all those exceptions are essentially life, you know? A lot of other circumstances come up, and all the circumstances, they will be granted all of these exceptions. So I think sometimes, I think we're all guilty of that, being part of religious congregations. The way we communicate with language is often very imprecise. And it's often defaults to a more strident position, even though perhaps in all our religious tradition, there's a lot more nuance and a lot more flexibility when we dig below the surface.
Mm-hmm. So I grew up in the years before Roe v. Wade, and I wasn't as aware of how strongly my religion supported abortion, and I think it's fair to say that most of my peers, most of my Jewish friends, also felt a lot of pressure not to get pregnant before marriage, not to get pregnant before they were in a committed relationship and could raise a child. And so I don't want to give the impression that it was simple for all these many years. And I don't even think Roe v. Wade made it simpler. I think that there still was a lot of societal pressure in many religious communities and throughout our society. In most of the United States of America, I think that kids growing up felt a lot of pressure. So it's not so simple. But getting to the question of, does my religion provide me comfort? Yes. I'm very fortunate that I don't have a conflict over that. I wish that our texts, and I wish that our community, because there's a large spectrum of diversity within the Jewish community, from the secular through Reform, Reconstructionist, and conservative. It's conservative with a little c, not a big C, or a big C, not a big C, not a little c, right? It's called the conservative movement because it believes in tradition and change, and it's conserving of tradition, but it's an unfortunate term. It's I like to call myself an egalitarian traditionalist as opposed to a conservative, because that's more accurate. There are Orthodox who will not be as strident about the support for abortion, but I think that in general, the religion does provide comfort on that. I feel completely as though the Jewish community's views have not been heard, and I came across something as I was doing my research last night into our sources. I came across a colleague of mine, a colleague of all of ours in New York City, Lauren Grable Herman, who is a rabbi at the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, which was founded by Mordechai Kaplan, a very prominent theologian and philosopher. She, in her source text on these texts pertaining to abortion, pointed out that the Christian tradition reads the text in Exodus differently because of the way the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the text, translated the Bible when it came to the Hebrew words for "and no harm will follow," meaning she's only lost her baby, it's not considered a major murder. They simply replaced it by the Greek for her child to be born perfectly formed. So a radically divergent departure from the Hebrew text. So it's understandable that's only one of several texts that have been translated differently, either in the Vulgate, which is the Roman, the Latin, or in the Septuagint. So that would cause our traditions to diverge in following the text, because if you didn't read it in the original Hebrew and you were reading it in its now new translation, you would think you were reading the text, and yet it was a different text. So I just wanted to add that into the conversation.
Look at you bringing out the Hebrew and the Greek. See?
Back at seminary again.
I taught Hebrew in the Presbyterian seminary, the God Box in Manhattan. So anyway, I just wanted to point out that I think it's important for us to, really just share these things, and that's one of the points. When the Dobbs decision occurred, I really went around my house like stamping around and screaming and saying, if only they understood what the text really said. And if Ruth Bader Ginsburg had been there to actually bring the Jewish, I'm really being honest, to bring the Jewish positions forward. When you say, were we heard? Completely unheard and fully non-represented, even in a forum where we had previously been represented. So, how unfortunately, that was the timing, and she had to die, it was really such a bad timing on her part.
And just to add, the NBC article that we shared in the Evite, just because you said it's not heard, I thought it's interesting. They say, while Jewish support for abortion has been recognized on some occasions, support for abortion rights, they're saying, oh yeah, everyone knows the Jewish viewpoint, and no. Thank you. I had something I was going to say, but Sarah, you go ahead, if you want to.
Yeah, I think what really gives me comfort in my specifically Lutheran tradition, and we don't have a monopoly on grace in the Lutheran Church, but we like to pretend that we do. And I think that is what brings me the most comfort in terms of this conversation, especially when providing pastoral care to folks, because most of the time I'm not going to be able to convince them that their Hebrew and Greek and translations are wrong. But what I can say is that God's grace is big enough for whether or not this was a really easy decision for you to have an abortion, or if it was the hardest decision you've ever made in your life, or if your parents are now going to kick you out of the house because of it, or, whatever the case is and whatever reproductive story folks have, the comfort that I have and that I can hopefully provide is that God's grace is big enough to cover all of that.
Thank you. I think as Presbyterian Christians, our leadership, and I would say, just as you kind of explained, ELCA, I am a PCUSA pastor, so different from Presbyterian Church of America, different from some other traditions that have broken off based on recent legislation in our denomination. We have a very aggressive social media, leadership website presence. And so I think with this particular issue, our denomination was ready to go and ready to put their views out there. Obviously, leadership has changed drastically over the years, and the amount of diversity and peoples of color who are leading our denomination has helped in some of that when the decision came out. I would say I do feel very comforted by the denomination's stance, even down to, as I look at the history, as a Presbyterian minister, if I'm employed by a Presbyterian agency, I'm then covered insurance-wise by the Board of Pensions. These decisions have gone into the Board of Pensions to make sure women's health care is put at the forefront. And so that is one situation, and yes, I feel very supported. But the ways in which I don't is that, especially having lived in Manhattan for 8 years, and I am a South Carolinian, I'm not unfamiliar to the South, coming back, how hush-hush the topic is. Even putting together this evening tonight, it's among various faith groups. Folks don't want to talk about it. They don't want to have their face be on the face of this issue. And in my denomination, I love that you and Joyce hosted what you did after the decision, or before, I guess when it was leaked, because that's what I want my denomination and our churches to do, is to get our viewpoints out there so that they know, yes, we are a diverse denomination as Presbyterians, but we have an official stance on this, and let's talk about it so that folks can come out of the shadows and actually feel like their voices can be heard. A couple more questions, then we'll open it up. WJCT broadcast, this issue of religious freedom came up, and someone said, and I've run this by a couple of lawyer friends, that no, it is not an issue of religious freedom, but a clarification of constitutional rights in regards to personal privacy. I think you might have been the only one on the radio who pushed back on this, but I would ask you, how do you view this recent legislation as an issue of religious freedom?
I think because the Dobbs decision is informed only by one religious tradition, it is infringing upon other religious traditions. So I think the issue of, in the Dobbs decision, the framing is problematic in my view. To frame it as a religious issue, there's only one issue over there. It's the woman's right to choose. It's an issue of a woman's freedom. The fact that the state is legislating about what a woman can do with their body, or a church is legislating what a woman can do with their body, it infringes upon the woman's agency. And that's the way I look at it. As a man, I would not want anybody to infringe upon my agency, but in my religious tradition, most of the lawmaking is done by men, and they're perfectly okay legislating what a woman should do, either with whether they should wear a scarf on their head or not wear a scarf on their head. My position, this is my personal position, not necessarily representative of every tradition within Islam, is that it's none of our business. Their choice, and as long as there is a common set of ethical values, or the question to me that is central is, what is the ethical compass around which we should govern? If we revert to religious text, the problem is religious text by its nature is interpretive. We just heard about translating from Hebrew and Greek, translating into Greek and then English, original Hebrew texts. The same problem exists in Islamic tradition. The challenge is a little bit less because Arabic is still a widely spoken language, So there are easier ways to access what the original Arabic could mean, but the Arabic in the Quran is not the Arabic that is spoken by Arabs today. In fact, we often joke, if Prophet Muhammad would come to any Arabic-speaking society, he would ask them, what language are you speaking? So even there is a sea change from the original to what the vernacular is today. And so often to understand the original, what it means, it's a process of interpretation. And the fact that so much of the interpretation, particularly in my tradition, is done by men trying to legislate on an issue that is exclusively affecting a woman is problematic in and of itself, because none of the men will ever understand exactly what it means for a woman to make a decision that is probably one of the most difficult decisions they would make in their lifetime. No man can understand that. And yet, the legislation being prescribed through religion becomes problematic in this. So if you look at, this is what I was going to come back to, this issue of praxis, like what is practiced in Muslim majority societies. Well, it depends upon what the nature of the state is. In a state where religion and state is more fused together, like Saudi Arabia, they tend to revert to a more conservative opinion and then tries to impose that upon the rest of society. In a state like Turkey, where it is a nominally secular state, Muslim majority but nominally secular, there is much more application of secular perspectives on this, not necessarily interpreting this difficult question from a textual perspective. So there's a spectrum over there. And as Muslims living as minorities in a country like US or the country where I originally come from in India, then again, it will be almost like an individual decision at that point. So now to see the state tell you can't do this, that I think is an infringement on religious freedom.
Thank you.
So I couldn't agree more. And I think that's actually where I want to begin, but I want to move towards what I see as the hypocrisy, and you alluded to some of the hypocrisies. I think it's the height of hypocrisy that that lawmakers have decided that parents and children don't have the right to make these decisions